Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. My wife cheated on me, so I ordered an alien of the deep web as a surprise. It was real. I never thought I'd be the type of guy to admit something like this, but here we are. I found out my wife was cheating on me a little over a month ago. It's one of those things you always think happens to someone else, right? Some sad guy on a talk show or a distant friend of a friend. But it happened to me, and I can't stop thinking about how pathetic that makes me feel. It started off innocently enough, or so I thought. She was working late more often, and at first I didn't think much of it. I mean, who hasn't had to pull a few extra hours at work now and then? But then the late nights turned into weekend trips with the girls that didn't make a lot of sense. And then there was her phone. We always had this unspoken agreement about privacy. I never snooped in her stuff, and she never snooped in mine. But one night, when she was asleep and her phone buzzed at 2 a.m., curiosity got the better of me. I wish it hadn't. The text was from someone named D. The message was short, simple, and to the point. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing. My stomach dropped. I knew she was lying to me. I didn't know who D was, but I knew enough to connect the dots. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I did what any reasonable person would do. I spiraled. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I kept thinking about who this guy was, what she saw in him, and how long this had been going on. I felt so small, so insignificant. It was like my entire life had been a lie. One night, after too many beers, I stumbled across something I shouldn't have. I was down the rabbit hole of the internet, looking for something to take my mind off everything, when I found myself on a forum that claimed to be a marketplace for the bizarre. Now, I'm not proud of what happened next, but I was drunk, heartbroken, and looking for some kind of distraction. Anything to make the pain go away. That's when I saw the ad. Alien experiences delivered to your doorstep, it read. There was a picture of something that looked like it came straight out of a sci-fi movie. Small, gray, with big black eyes and spindly fingers. The text promised a once-in-a-lifetime experience for those who dared to explore the unknown. I laughed at first. It was obviously some kind of joke, right? But then, as I kept reading, I saw the testimonials. People were saying it was legit, that they'd actually received something strange in the mail. Some said it was the most terrifying experience of their lives. Others that it was like nothing they'd ever seen before. Something clicked in my drunken brain. I know, it's stupid. But in that moment, I thought, screw it. My wife had made me feel like crap, like I was nothing, and here was something that could give me a bit of control back. If this was real, if it was anything like what they said, I could at least feel like I was doing something. I could surprise her, maybe freak her out a bit, and feel like I'd gotten the last laugh. So I placed an order. It wasn't cheap. The whole thing cost me a little over $1,000, but I didn't care. I justified it to myself, thinking that if it was a scam, at least I'd be out the money and not have to think about it again. But if it was real, well, that was a whole different story. I went to bed that night feeling strangely satisfied, like I'd done something to take control of my life again. I even managed to sleep a bit, which was more than I could say for the previous few weeks. The next morning, with a pounding headache, I barely remembered what I'd done. It wasn't until I checked my email and saw the confirmation that I realized it wasn't just some weird dream. I had actually ordered an alien off the deep web. That's when the waiting started, and that's when things got weird. The days that followed were surreal. I half expected some shady guy in a trench coat to show up at my door with a box, or for the whole thing to just disappear from my mind like a drunken mistake. But instead, life continued, almost as if nothing had happened, except for this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. I'd catch myself wondering if I had made a huge mistake, if maybe I'd invited something into my life that I couldn't undo. Then there was my wife. She acted like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't shattered my world just weeks before. She was still taking her girls' trips, still sending secretive texts. I'd see her laughing at something on her phone and feel a rage bubbling up inside me that I barely kept in check. I didn't confront her though. I don't know why. Maybe part of me was waiting for this alien thing to show up, to throw it in her face somehow, to make her feel as terrified and out of control as I did. But days turned into weeks, and there was nothing. No package, no weird emails, not even a spam message trying to sell me fake alien memorabilia. It was like the whole thing had never happened. I started to think I'd been scammed. $1,000 down the drain, and all I had to show for it was a gnawing anxiety that I couldn't shake. And then 3 weeks after I placed the order, something changed. It started with the dreams. They were vivid and unsettling, the kind that stick with you long after you've woken up. In one, I was standing in our living room, except it wasn't really our living room. Everything was slightly off, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing in and out as if they were alive, and the furniture was distorted, twisted into shapes that didn't make sense. And then there was the smell. It was thick, metallic, almost like blood, but sharper, more acrid. I'd hear something behind me in the dream, faint whispering, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just this overwhelming sense that something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that the dream was more than just a dream. The dreams kept coming, night after night. I stopped sleeping much at all, afraid of what I might see the next time I closed my eyes. And it wasn't just the dreams. I started noticing things around the house, small things, but things that made my skin crawl. Like the way the lights would flicker, not all the time, but just enough to make me notice. Or how I'd find objects out of place, my keys in the freezer, the remote in the bathroom. I'd chalk it up to stress, to my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And then, one night, it happened. I was in bed, tossing and turning, trying to will myself to sleep, despite the dread pooling in my gut. My wife was beside me, sleeping soundly, oblivious to everything. I envied her in that moment, how easily she could drift off, while I was stuck in this waking nightmare. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails lightly drumming against wood. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to hear where it was coming from. It was soft at first, almost too quiet to notice, but then it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from downstairs, near the front door. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, a branch brushing against the side of the house, something mundane, but deep down, I knew better. The tapping continued, slow and methodical, like someone or something was deliberately trying to get my attention. I glanced at my wife, still sleeping peacefully, and felt a strange sense of detachment. I should have woken her up, but something held me back, something primal that told me I was better off facing this alone. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept down the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtains. The tapping grew louder as I approached the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I couldn't tell if it was coming from inside the house or just outside the door, but every instinct told me to turn back, to forget I'd ever heard it. But I couldn't. I had to know. When I reached the front door, the tapping stopped. Just like that, it was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to open the door, to see if there was anything on the other side, but another part of me, the part that still had a shred of self-preservation left, screamed at me to leave it alone, but I couldn't just walk away. I had to know if this was all in my head, if maybe the stress had finally pushed me over the edge. So, with trembling hands, I unlocked the door and slowly pulled it open. There was nothing there, just the empty porch, the cool night air, and the faint hum of the streetlight. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, feeling both relieved and slightly foolish. Maybe it was just my imagination after all. But as I closed the door, something caught my eye, something small and dark on the welcome mat. I bent down to get a closer look, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw what it was. A tiny, perfectly smooth stone, black as night and cold to the touch. It shouldn't have meant anything, but somehow I knew it was a message, a sign that whatever I'd ordered, whatever I'd invited into my life, was closer than I'd ever imagined, and it was only just beginning. After that night, the sense of dread that had been gnawing at me for weeks only deepened. The black stone felt like a ticking clock, a countdown to something I couldn't see, but could almost feel in the air around me. I kept it though. I didn't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I placed it on the shelf in the hallway, right next to the framed photos of our wedding and the vacation we took to Italy a few years ago, back when I thought we were happy. The next few days were tense. I found myself jumping at every little sound, half expecting the tapping to return, or worse. My wife noticed, of course. She asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't tell her. What was I supposed to say? That I was waiting for something that may or may not be real, something I'd ordered off the deep web in a moment of drunken despair. She'd think I was insane. Hell, I was starting to think that myself. But then it happened again. It was a Saturday afternoon, and my wife was out with her friends. I was alone in the house, trying to distract myself with mindless TV, when the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. No one ever visited us unannounced, especially not on a weekend. I hesitated, staring at the door like it was about to come alive and swallow me whole. When I finally mustered the courage to get up and answer it, I wasn't prepared for what I found. There was a package on the doorstep. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no markings, no return address, nothing to indicate where it had come from. But as soon as I saw it, I knew it was connected to the order I'd placed. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than I expected, like there was something solid and dense inside. I brought it inside, placing it on the kitchen table. For a long time, I just stared at it, too afraid to open it, but too curious to leave it alone. I kept telling myself that it was just some elaborate prank, that I'd open it up and find a cheap toy or a gag gift, but that didn't explain the stone, the dreams, the tapping. Something wasn't right, and deep down, I knew opening that package would change everything, but I couldn't stop myself. With a deep breath, I grabbed a knife from the drawer and sliced through the paper. Inside was a simple black box, unadorned and featureless, like a small jewelry box. My heart was pounding in my chest as I lifted the lid, expecting I don't know what. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was small, about the size of a tennis ball, and covered in some kind of translucent membrane. It was faintly glowing, pulsating with a soft, eerie light that made my skin crawl. But what really got to me was the fact that it seemed alive. The thing inside the membrane moved slightly, shifting as if it was aware of my presence. My first instinct was to slam the lid shut and throw the whole thing in the trash, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, staring at this thing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't just the fact that it was alive. It was the feeling it gave me. A deep, bone-chilling cold that seeped into the room, making the air thick and heavy. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but eventually, the thing inside the box started to move more deliberately. It twitched and writhed, pressing against the membrane as if trying to break free. Panic surged through me, and I finally snapped the lid shut, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped it. I backed away from the table, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave it there, but I was terrified to touch it again. My mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. What had I done? What had I brought into my home? And then, as if in answer to my unspoken question, the lights flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the box on the table. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood there, paralyzed, listening to the oppressive silence. But the silence didn't last long. There was a soft, slithering sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. My blood ran cold. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something moving in the dark. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I backed up slowly, my foot hitting the leg of a chair and nearly sending me tumbling. The sound stopped for a moment, as if whatever it was had heard me, and then it resumed, getting closer. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against the counter until they found the handle of the knife I had used to open the package. I gripped it tightly, feeling the cold metal against my skin, and took a deep breath. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I had to protect myself. The sound grew louder, and I felt something brush against my ankle, cold and wet, like a slimy tendril. I jumped back, swinging the knife wildly, but there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. Then suddenly, the lights flickered back on. I blinked, disoriented, my eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. The kitchen was exactly as it had been, the box still sitting on the table, the knife still clutched in my trembling hand. But the slithering sound was gone. Whatever had been there, whatever had brushed against me, was nowhere to be seen. I slowly lowered the knife, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me? But I knew better. I could still feel the cold, wet sensation on my skin, like something had left its mark on me. And then, as I stood there trying to make sense of it all, I heard the faintest of whispers, almost too soft to hear. It was coming from the box. I didn't stick around to find out what it was saying. I grabbed the box, knife still in hand, and bolted upstairs. I wasn't thinking straight. All I knew was that I had to get out of the house, away from whatever I'd unleashed. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard the door to our bedroom creak open, and I froze. My wife was standing there, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She looked at me, then at the box in my hands, and her face went pale. She didn't say a word, but I could see the question in her eyes. "What have you done?" But I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that whatever I had brought into our lives was no longer something I could control, and it wasn't going to let us go that easily. The look on my wife's face is something I'll never forget. Pure, unfiltered terror. We stood there at the top of the stairs, staring at each other in a silence so thick it felt like it could choke us. I could see 1,000 questions swirling in her eyes, but I knew I didn't have answers for any of them. All I had was the box in my hands and the creeping dread that whatever was inside had already started to unravel our lives. Finally, she broke the silence. "What is that?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? That I had gone looking for a way to get back at her, to fill the void her betrayal had left in me, and instead, I'd brought something unspeakable into our home. Instead, I just shook my head, mutely handing her the box. She didn't want to touch it. I could see that in the way her hands hovered in the air, uncertain, but there was something about it, something compelling, that made her reach out despite herself. The moment her fingers brushed against the lid, a shudder ran through her body. I almost snatched it back, but she had already taken it from me, her hands trembling as she held it up to the light. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice thin and strained. "Online," I muttered, feeling a wave of shame wash over me. I thought it was a joke, or some kind of prank, but it's not. She looked at me, eyes wide. "What's inside?" I shook my head. "I don't know. I mean, I saw something, but I don't know what it is. It's alive though, I know that much." She stared at the box, and I could see the struggle playing out on her face. Part of her wanted to throw it as far away as she could, but another part of her was morbidly curious. I understood the feeling all too well. That box had a pull, a strange magnetism that was hard to resist. Before I could say anything, she lifted the lid. At first, nothing happened. The soft, eerie glow inside the box illuminated her face, casting shadows that made her look almost unrecognizable. But then the thing inside started to move again. It shifted, pushing against the membrane like it was trying to break free. My wife gasped, jerking back, but she didn't drop the box. We both watched, horrified, as the membrane began to stretch, slowly thinning until it was nearly translucent. Through it, I could see something moving, writhing, long, sinewy tendrils that curled and uncurled with a sickening fluidity. It was trying to escape, trying to reach out and touch us. My wife slammed the lid shut, and we both stumbled back, the horror of what we'd just seen sinking in. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but the only thing I knew for sure was that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Suddenly, the house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. We both froze, eyes darting around as the noise grew louder, more intense, like the house itself was waking up. The lights flickered again, and then, without warning, they went out completely, plunging us into darkness, Panic surged through me. I reached out blindly, grabbing my wife's arm. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. She didn't argue. Together, we groped our way down the stairs, stumbling in the pitch blackness. I could hear that slithering sound again, closer this time, like it was following us, chasing us. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't see a thing. The darkness was so thick, so oppressive, that it felt like it was closing in around us. We finally made it to the front door, but when I reached for the handle, something stopped me. An overwhelming sense of dread, like opening that door would unleash something even worse. My hand hovered over the knob, trembling, and for a moment I couldn't move. I just stood there, paralyzed, listening to the soft, wet sound of something dragging itself across the floor behind us. My wife was whispering my name, urging me to hurry, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, unable to shake the feeling that we were making a huge mistake. Then, the slithering sound grew louder, and I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck, something wet and slimy. I bolted forward, wrenching the door open with all the strength I could muster, and we spilled out onto the porch. The night air hit us like a slap in the face, cold and biting. I slammed the door shut behind us, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, we just stood there, gasping for breath, too terrified to even look at each other. But then I heard it. The tapping. It was coming from inside the house, right on the other side of the door. Soft, insistent, like fingers drumming against the wood. I backed away, pulling my wife with me, until we were standing in the middle of the yard, staring at the darkened house. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. Whatever was inside that box, whatever I had ordered, it had already changed everything. I could feel it, deep in my bones, a sense of foreboding, of inevitability, like this was only the beginning of something much, much worse. And as we stood there in the cold night air, listening to the rhythmic tapping, I realized that there was no going back. We had unleashed something beyond our understanding, something that wasn't going to let us go. Not now. Not ever. That's when the tapping stopped, and in the silence that followed, we heard it. A soft whispering voice, speaking words we couldn't understand, but that sent chills down our spines all the same. It was coming from the box, and it was getting louder. The whispering grew louder, like it was seeping through the walls, filling the night air with an otherworldly presence. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but the tone alone was enough to send a shiver down my spine. My wife and I stood frozen in the yard, staring at the house, our breaths visible in the cold air, mingling with the fog of fear that hung between us. I could feel it, the presence from the box, like a pressure building inside the house, ready to burst out and consume everything. The tapping had stopped, but the whispering continued, insistent and relentless, wrapping around us like invisible tendrils, pulling us closer to the darkness that had taken root in our home. My wife squeezed my hand, her grip so tight it hurt. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling with barely controlled panic. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing fit. I had unleashed something ancient and malevolent, something that didn't belong in our world. And now it was here, in our home, growing stronger by the minute. And then, as if sensing my thoughts, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, thick and suffocating, pressing down on us with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I could feel something watching us, something just beyond the threshold of our understanding, waiting for us to make a move. In the quiet, I heard it, the faint creak of the front door. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw it slowly opening, inch by inch, like it was being pushed by an unseen hand. My wife let out a small gasp, and I felt her tense beside me, ready to run, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the darkness inside the house, on the widening gap between the door and the frame, as if something was inviting us back in. Then, without warning, the door slammed open, crashing against the wall with a force that made us both jump. The whispering returned, louder this time, echoing through the night, and I realized it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the box, the black box that was still clutched in my wife's hands, the lid trembling as if it was barely containing the force inside. I looked at her, and in her eyes, I saw the same realization dawn. Whatever was happening, it was centered around the box. It wasn't just some object we could throw away or destroy. It was a gateway, a conduit to something far beyond our understanding. But what could we do? Running didn't seem like an option. I had brought this thing into our lives, and now it was our responsibility to deal with it, if we even could. "Give me the box," I said, my voice low and steady, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. She hesitated, her eyes darting between the box and my face. I could see the fear in her eyes, but also a strange sense of resignation. She knew, as well as I did, that there was no other choice. Slowly, she handed it to me, her fingers lingering on the lid for just a moment before she let go. The moment it was in my hands, I felt the weight of it, not just physically, but mentally. It was like holding pure malevolence, something that shouldn't exist in this world. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with a cacophony of sounds that made me want to drop the box and run. But I couldn't. I had to face whatever this was. With a deep breath, I made a decision. I started walking toward the house. "Wait, what are you doing?" my wife cried, grabbing my arm. "You can't go back in there." "I have to," I said, though I didn't fully understand why. It was like an instinct, a pull that I couldn't resist. "I have to put it back. Whatever it is, it belongs there. It doesn't belong with us." She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, but she didn't try to stop me again. She just nodded, tears welling up in her eyes as she let go of my arm. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded and turned back to the house. The door was still wide open, the darkness inside almost tangible, like a living thing waiting to swallow me whole. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped across the threshold, the box heavy in my hands, the whispers now so loud they drowned out everything else. The house was pitch black, but I didn't need light to know where to go. I was being guided, pulled by some unseen force toward the center of the house. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked, the air thick with that same metallic acrid smell from my dreams. As I reached the living room, the whispers suddenly stopped, plunging me into a silence so deep it rang in my ears. I stood there, in the center of the room, the box in my hands, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Then slowly, the lid of the box began to lift on its own. I wanted to drop it, to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the box as the lid opened fully, revealing the thing inside. The translucent membrane had dissolved, leaving behind a mass of tendrils, pulsing and writhing, glowing with that same eerie light. It looked at me, or at least I felt it look at me, though it had no eyes, No face, just an overwhelming presence that filled the room, pressing down on me from all sides. I knew then, with a clarity that was both terrifying and strangely calm, that this thing wasn't from our world. It wasn't even from our dimension. It was something older, something far more powerful than I could comprehend, and I'd invited it into my life. The tendrils reached out, slowly wrapping around my arms, my legs, my chest. It was cold, so cold it burned, but I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything but stand there as it enveloped me, pulling me closer, drawing me into its embrace. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The tendrils withdrew, the light faded, and the box snapped shut, sealing whatever was inside back into its prison. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. The room was silent again, the air clear, the oppressive weight lifted. I looked around, half expecting something to leap out at me, but there was nothing. Just the normal, everyday objects of our living room, bathed in the soft glow of the street lamp outside. It was over. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the box, before I finally found the strength to stand. My wife was still outside, waiting, and I had to get to her, to tell her it was done. But as I turned to leave, something stopped me, an instinct, a voice in the back of my mind. I looked down at the box in my hands, and for the first time, I understood. It wasn't just a conduit or a gateway. It was a key to something far worse, something that was waiting on the other side, biding its time. And I had just opened the door. The whispers returned, soft and distant, like an echo of what had been. But this time, they were inside my head, a constant, unending murmur that I knew would never go away. As I stepped out into the night, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever I had invited into my life wasn't done with me yet, and it never would be. My new roommate predicted my future. I found on the dark web what he is doing. I moved into the city a few months ago, chasing a job that barely covered the rent. Finding a decent place to live was a struggle. So when I saw the Craigslist ad for a room in a nice area, I jumped on it. The guy who posted it seemed chill. His name was Andrew, mid-20s, clean-cut, and friendly enough in the few texts we exchanged. He said he was a software developer, working from home most days, which was perfect since I worked odd hours and didn't want to deal with noisy roommates. When I went to check out the place, it was better than I expected. It was a 2-bedroom apartment in a relatively safe neighborhood, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. I remember thinking it was almost too good to be true, but at the time, I was just relieved I wouldn't have to sleep in my car. Andrew showed me around the apartment, and everything seemed legit. He was soft-spoken, a bit socially awkward maybe, but who isn't these days? After we talked for a bit, he offered me the room on the spot. I didn't hesitate. I moved in the next day with nothing but a suitcase and a laptop. For the first week, things were great. Andrew mostly kept to himself, spending hours in his room with the door closed, probably working or gaming. We made small talk when we crossed paths in the kitchen, but it never got deeper than discussing the weather or some new show on Netflix. Then, about a week in, something strange happened. It was a Friday night, and I had just gotten home from a late shift at work. I was exhausted, looking forward to collapsing on my bed, when I noticed an envelope on my nightstand. It was just lying there, my name scrawled across the front, in a neat, almost robotic handwriting. I had no idea how it got there, since I always kept my door locked when I wasn't home. My first thought was that Andrew might have slipped it in, but why? We barely knew each other. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and what was written on it made my blood run cold. It was a list of personal details about me, stuff that no one should know. My full name, date of birth, my last address, even the name of my childhood pet. But the most disturbing part was at the bottom of the page. It said, "Tomorrow, you will lose your job." I laughed it off at first. It had to be a prank, right? But as much as I tried to brush it off, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. I stayed up way too late that night, tossing and turning, trying to figure out who could have left the note and why. I even considered confronting Andrew about it, but every time I imagined that awkward conversation, I chickened out. The next morning, I went into work as usual, still haunted by that note. I didn't think much of it until just before lunch, when my boss called me into his office. My stomach dropped when I saw the grim look on his face. He told me the company was downsizing, and unfortunately, my position was being eliminated. I was stunned. I had worked there for years without any issues, and out of nowhere, I was being let go. As I packed up my things, the words from that note echoed in my mind. "Tomorrow, you will lose your job." How could anyone have known that? It felt like I was living in some kind of nightmare. I went home in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities. By the time I got back to the apartment, I was ready to confront Andrew, even if it made me look crazy. But when I walked in, he wasn't there. His door was closed, and I could hear the faint tapping of his keyboard through the wall. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at his door, wondering what kind of person he really was. Was he some kind of hacker? Or was it just a sick joke? Before I could make up my mind, I noticed something else. A small package on the kitchen counter with my name on it. It hadn't been there when I left. I picked it up, hands trembling, and tore it open. Inside was a tiny USB drive. No note this time, just the drive, cold and metallic in my hand. I felt a chill run through me as I realized there was only one way to find out what was on it. I plugged it into my laptop, half expecting some kind of virus to start eating away at my files. Instead, there was just one file on it, an audio recording. With my heart pounding in my chest, I clicked play. The voice that came through the speakers was Andrew's. There was no mistaking it. But what he said made my blood run cold. "I'm sorry about your job, but it had to happen. It's just the beginning." That's when I knew this was no joke. And whatever Andrew was up to, I was about to be in way over my head. I stared at my laptop screen, the words of Andrew's voice looping in my head. "It's just the beginning." What the hell did that mean? I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket, but it was no use. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. For the next few hours, I couldn't focus on anything. I just kept pacing around the apartment, replaying the recording in my mind, wondering what Andrew could possibly be planning. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would a seemingly normal guy go out of his way to mess with me like this? What did he have to gain? At some point, I found myself standing outside his bedroom door again, my fist raised to knock, but then I hesitated. What was I going to say? "Hey man, did you predict my job loss and leave creepy notes in my room?" It sounded insane, even in my head, but then again, so did everything that had happened so far. Instead, I decided to do something I hadn't considered before. I did a quick Google search on Andrew's name, hoping to find something, anything, that might give me a clue about who I was really living with. But there was nothing. No social media profiles, no LinkedIn, no mentions in old high school newsletters. It was like he didn't exist before he posted that Craigslist ad. I felt like I was hitting a dead end. The more I tried to figure him out, the more questions I had. And that's when I remembered something, a story I had heard a while back about people finding hidden cameras in their apartments, planted by landlords or creepy roommates. My skin crawled at the thought, but I had to know. I spent the next hour scouring every inch of my room, searching for anything that seemed out of place. I checked the smoke detector, the light fixtures, even inside the vents. Nothing. But as I was about to give up, something caught my eye. The power outlet near my bed looked off. The screws were slightly loose, like someone had recently tampered with it. I grabbed a screwdriver and carefully pried the cover off. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what was inside. A tiny camera, no bigger than a button, nestled inside the outlet. It was angled perfectly to capture my bed and most of the room. I felt sick to my stomach. How long had this been here? And more importantly, who put it there? There was no question in my mind that Andrew was behind this. I wanted to confront him right then and there, but fear held me back. If he was watching me, he'd know that I found the camera. What if that was part of his plan? What if this was just another step in whatever twisted game he was playing? Instead of storming into his room, I did the only thing I could think of. I put the outlet cover back and pretended I hadn't found anything. I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. I decided to stay out of the apartment as much as possible, spending my days at coffee shops and libraries, anywhere but home. But every night I had to go back, and the tension was unbearable. It was on the third night that things escalated. I had just gotten back from a long walk, trying to clear my head, when I noticed something different about my room. The envelope was back. It was lying on my bed, just like before, with my name on it. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I tore it open, my hands shaking. The note inside was brief, just 3 words. Check your email. I ran to my laptop and opened my inbox. Sure enough, there was an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank, and the body contained a single link. Everything in me screamed not to click it, but curiosity got the better of me. I hovered over the link, checking where it led, and my blood ran cold when I saw the domain. It was a dotted onion link, something that could only be accessed through the Tor browser. I had heard of the dark web before, but I had never had any reason to venture into that part of the internet. It was a place for illegal activity, shady dealings, and things much darker than I ever wanted to know. But if Andrew was sending me there, I needed to see what was waiting for me. I downloaded Tor, my heart pounding in my chest, and typed in the link. The site loaded slowly, the screen dark except for a single video player in the center. Without thinking, I clicked play. The video was grainy, filmed in low light, but I recognized the setting immediately. It was my room. The camera seemed to be placed near the ceiling, capturing a wide shot of my bed. And then I saw myself. I was lying there, fast asleep, completely unaware that I was being watched. But I wasn't alone. Andrew was in the frame too, standing over my bed, staring down at me. My heart raced as I watched him lean in closer, his hand hovering just inches above my face. He stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, just watching as if he was deciding something. Then without warning, the screen went black. I sat there frozen, unable to move or think. I had been right under his nose the entire time, and I hadn't even realized it. But what terrified me most was the realization that this wasn't just about surveillance. Andrew had been in my room, inches away from me, while I was asleep, and he had filmed it. That's when I knew I had to get out. Whatever Andrew was planning, it was far from over, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what came next. But as I packed my things in a frenzy, a new notification popped up on my screen. It was another email from that same anonymous address. I almost didn't want to open it, but I forced myself to click. The message was simple. You can't run. I felt the walls closing in on me. I was trapped, and Andrew knew it, but I wasn't going to let him win that easily. I had to find out what was really going on, no matter how deep I had to dig, and I knew exactly where to start. I couldn't sleep that night. I just sat on the edge of my bed, my eyes darting around the room, paranoid that Andrew could be watching me at any moment. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind against the window, sent shivers down my spine. The more I thought about that video, the more I realized I was dealing with something way beyond just a creepy roommate. This was something darker, something I couldn't fully understand yet, but I was about to find out. First thing the next morning, I called in sick to work. Not that it mattered much since I was already laid off, and I decided to start digging. I needed to know who Andrew really was and why he seemed to know so much about me. But I knew that whatever I was looking for, it wasn't going to be on the regular internet. The .onion link he sent me was just a hint that I was dealing with something on the dark web. I had heard stories about the dark web, places where people traded illegal drugs, hired hitmen, or shared the kind of content that would make your skin crawl. But I'd never really believed those stories were true. They always felt like urban legends, something out of a bad horror movie. But now, it was clear that Andrew was pulling me into that world, and I had no choice but to follow the trail. I started by searching for any mention of Andrew on forums and message boards, but just like my earlier search, I came up empty. It was as if he didn't exist anywhere except in my apartment. But then, I remembered something, a vague conversation I once had with a tech-savvy friend about how some people on the dark web use aliases, fake identities that are impossible to trace. If Andrew was using one of those, it would explain why I couldn't find anything on him. I decided to dig deeper into the dark web, starting with the basics. I found a guide on how to navigate it safely, how to avoid traps set by law enforcement, and how to remain anonymous. I wasn't exactly a hacker, but I knew enough about computers to get by. The more I read, the more I realized just how dangerous this could be. But I had to do it. I had to know what Andrew was hiding. I spent the next several hours exploring various dark websites, most of which were as disturbing as I had imagined. I saw things I'll never be able to unsee. Things that made my stomach turn and my heart race. But I pushed through, determined to find something, anything that could give me a clue about Andrew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled across a site that caught my attention. It was a forum, buried deep within the layers of the dark web, where people shared stories, tips, and advice on how to remain undetected. The users seemed to be a mix of hackers, criminals, and others who lived on the fringes of society. And there, buried in one of the threads, I found a mention of someone who matched Andrew's description, a user who went by the alias The Watcher. The posts about The Watcher were vague, but there was a common theme. This person had a reputation for being able to predict things, to manipulate events in ways that seemed almost supernatural. People claimed he had ruined lives, driven people to madness, and even caused deaths, all while staying completely anonymous. No one knew his real name, where he lived, or how he operated. But one thing was clear: the Watcher was dangerous. As I read through the posts, my heart pounded in my chest. Could this be Andrew? Could the man I was living with be this shadowy figure who seemed to control people's lives from the shadows? It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a thriller novel, but after everything I had experienced, I couldn't dismiss it. One post in particular stood out to me. It was from a user who claimed to have been targeted by the Watcher. The user described how their life had been systematically destroyed. First, they lost their job. Then their friends turned against them. And finally, they were driven to the brink of insanity by a series of inexplicable events. The user warned others to stay away, to never try to contact the Watcher, because once you were on his radar, there was no escape. My blood ran cold as I read the final line of the post. He knows you're reading this. It's already too late. I slammed my laptop shut, my mind racing. Was this really happening? Was I next on the Watcher's list? And if so, how did he know so much about me? I couldn't believe that I was just another random victim. There had to be a reason, a connection that I hadn't figured out yet. But as much as I wanted to run, to get as far away from Andrew as possible, I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I couldn't shake the feeling that the longer I waited, the closer I was getting to some kind of breaking point. And if the posts about the Watcher were true, I was already in way over my head. I knew what I had to do next, even though it terrified me. I needed to find a way to talk to Andrew, to confront him about everything I had found, to see if he would admit to being the Watcher. But I couldn't just knock on his door and demand answers. If he really was this dangerous, I needed to be careful, to plan my approach carefully. That night, I sat in my room, trying to come up with a plan, but every idea I had seemed to end in disaster. I knew Andrew was watching me, probably even listening to me right now, so I couldn't exactly just barge into his room and accuse him of being some kind of dark web mastermind. Instead, I decided to take a different approach. I would wait until he left the apartment. If I could get into his room and find anything, any clue that could confirm my suspicions, I would be one step closer to figuring out what was really going on. It was risky, but it was the only option I had left. The next day, I waited patiently for Andrew to leave. I tried to act normal, pretending I wasn't completely freaked out by the thought of what I was about to do. Finally, around noon, I heard the front door open and close. I waited a few minutes, just to be sure he was gone. Then I made my move. His room was locked, of course, but I had come prepared. I had grabbed a set of tools from a hardware store earlier in the week, just in case I needed to get in. It took a few tries, but eventually I managed to pick the lock. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the door open, stepping into the unknown. Andrew's room was surprisingly ordinary. A bed, a desk with a computer, and a few shelves lined with books and random tech gadgets. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. There was an eerie stillness to the room, like it was just a facade hiding something much darker. I went straight to his computer, praying he hadn't set up some kind of password or security system. To my surprise, it was wide open. As I clicked through his files, I started to find things that made my stomach turn. There were folders filled with videos of me, taken in my room, in the kitchen, even in the living room. He had been watching me for God knows how long, recording my every move. But that wasn't the worst part. In one of the folders, I found a file labeled Future. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I clicked it open. Inside was a document, a list of dates and events. My name was at the top, and under it were predictions, just like the one I had found in that first note. But these were even more detailed, more terrifying. 8/15, lose job. 8/18, confrontation with Andrew. 8/20, move out. The list went on, each prediction more disturbing than the last. But what made my blood run cold was the final entry. 8/25, disappear. My breath caught in my throat. That was less than a week away. Was Andrew planning to do something to me? Was this all part of some sick game? I didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear. I was running out of time. As I closed the file, I noticed something else on his desktop, a folder labeled The Watcher. I clicked on it, half expecting it to be empty, but inside were dozens of files, each one labeled with a different name. Some of the names I recognized from the posts on the dark web, people who had claimed to be targeted by the Watcher. And then, at the bottom of the list, I saw my own name. I felt like I was going to be sick. Andrew wasn't just messing with me. He had been planning this from the start. And now, I was just another name on his list. But there was something else in that folder. Something I hadn't expected. A video file, recently saved. I clicked on it, my heart pounding in my ears. The video was dark, grainy, just like the one I had seen before. But this time, it wasn't in my room. It was in a different place, somewhere unfamiliar. The camera panned around slowly, revealing a dark, windowless room with concrete walls. And then, I saw it. A single chair, bolted to the floor, with thick metal chains hanging from the armrests. I realized with horror what it was. A place where someone could be kept, hidden away from the world. A place where someone could disappear. The screen went black, and a single line of text appeared. You're next. I slammed the laptop shut, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't just run. Andrew would know. He would find me. I needed to come up with a plan, something that would throw him off, buy me some time to figure out what to do next. But as I backed out of his room, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of the front door opening. Andrew was home. My heart dropped into my stomach as I heard the front door close. The faint sound of Andrew's footsteps echoed through the hallway, getting closer with every passing second. I was trapped. There was no way I could slip out of his room without him seeing me. The only option I had left was to hide. But where? I quickly scanned the room, my eyes landing on the closet. It wasn't the most original hiding spot, but it was the only option I had. I darted inside, pulling the door shut, just as I heard Andrew's footsteps stop outside his bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard I was sure he would hear it. The door creaked open, and I heard him step inside. Through the slats of the closet door, I could see him standing there, looking around his room. His face was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that set every nerve in my body on edge. He knew something was off. He could feel it, just like I could. For a moment, he just stood there, scanning the room. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't check the closet, that he would just shrug it off and leave. But instead, he moved to his desk, sitting down at his computer. My stomach tightened as I realized he was going to see that someone had been on it. The files I had opened, the video I had watched, it would all be there, staring him in the face. I watched as he moved the mouse, the screen lighting up. His eyes narrowed, and I knew the moment he saw it. His hand froze, gripping the mouse so tightly his knuckles turned white. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I had to bite down on my lip to keep from making a sound. Then, without warning, he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I could hear his footsteps pounding down the hallway, and then the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I didn't wait to find out what it was. As soon as I heard him leave, I bolted from the closet and out of his room. My heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I sprinted to my room and locked the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't have much time. Whatever Andrew was planning, it was happening now. I needed to get out of the apartment, but I had to be smart about it. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, as I texted the only person I could think of. My friend Chris. He was the one person I knew who had some experience with this kind of thing. Someone who could help me figure out what to do next. My message was simple. Need help. Now. It didn't take long for him to respond. He was already asking questions, but I didn't have time to explain. I just told him where I was and that I needed to get out, fast. He said he'd be there in 15 minutes. It felt like an eternity. I started throwing my things into a bag, trying to move as quickly and quietly as possible. I didn't know if Andrew was still in the apartment, or if he was coming back, but I couldn't take any chances. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards made me jump, expecting him to burst through the door at any moment. As I packed, my mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened. The notes, the videos, the dark web. None of it made sense. Why me? What did Andrew want with me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that none of this was random. He had chosen me for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't good. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked out the window and saw Chris's beat-up Honda idling at the curb. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. I had to get out of the apartment without Andrew seeing me. I slung my bag over my shoulder and crept to the front door. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sign of movement. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't know where Andrew was, but I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could and slipped out into the hallway. The apartment was eerily still, the only sound the distant hum of the refrigerator. I moved quickly, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way to the front door. Every step felt like it echoed through the entire building, loud enough to wake the dead. Just as I reached the door, I heard it, a low rumbling noise coming from the other side of the apartment. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, as the sound grew louder. It was coming from Andrew's room. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I yanked the door open and bolted out into the hallway, slamming it behind me. I didn't look back as I sprinted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing off the walls. All I could think about was getting to Chris's car, getting as far away from that apartment as possible. Chris was already out of the car, waiting for me, his face a mix of concern and confusion. He opened the door, and I threw my bag into the backseat before diving in after it. As soon as I was in, he slammed the door and peeled away from the curb, his tires screeching on the pavement. "Dude, what the hell is going on?" Chris asked, glancing at me as he sped down the street. "I'll explain everything, but we need to get out of here first," I said, my voice shaky. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Andrew chasing after us. Chris didn't ask any more questions. He just drove, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I finally started to calm down a bit as the city streets blurred by, but the fear in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. After what felt like forever, Chris pulled into a parking lot behind an old diner far from the apartment. He turned off the engine and looked at me, waiting for an explanation. I took a deep breath and started to tell him everything about Andrew, the notes, the videos, the dark web, and the watcher. I could see the disbelief in his eyes as I spoke, but he didn't interrupt. When I was done, he just sat there, staring at me like I had just told him I was from another planet. "This is insane," he finally said. "But if it's true, we need to do something. You can't just go back there." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But what do I do?" "He knows everything about me, Chris. I can't hide from him." Chris was silent for a moment, thinking. Then he pulled out his phone and started typing something. "I know a guy," he said after a moment. "He's good with computers, knows his way around the dark web. If anyone can figure out who this Andrew guy really is, it's him." I nodded, grateful for any kind of help. "What do we do in the meantime?" Chris looked at me, his expression serious. "We lay low. We keep moving, and we don't let him find us." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. I just hoped it would be enough. We drove for hours, weaving through the city streets and taking random turns to throw off anyone who might be following us. Every so often, I would glance behind us, half expecting to see Andrew's face staring back at me from the shadows, but the streets remained empty, just a blur of lights and darkness as we sped through the night. Chris's contact, the guy who was supposed to help us, lived in a rundown part of town, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions and minded their own business. When we finally pulled up to his building, it looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The windows were cracked, the paint peeling, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. "This is it," Chris said, parking the car and cutting the engine. "You sure you want to do this?" I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to turn around, to forget everything, and just disappear. But I knew that wasn't an option. Whatever was going on, it was only going to get worse if I didn't face it head on. "Let's go," I finally said, opening the car door. We made our way into the building, the creaky wooden stairs groaning under our weight as we climbed to the third floor. Chris knocked on a door at the end of a dimly lit hallway, the sound echoing off the cracked walls. The door opened a few seconds later, revealing a man in his 30s with a scruffy beard and dark circles under his eyes. He looked us up and down, his gaze lingering on me, for a moment before he stepped aside to let us in. "You must be Chris's friend," he said, closing the door behind us. "Name's Mike." "Thanks for helping us out," I said, my voice shaky. Mike just nodded, gesturing for us to follow him into a cluttered living room. Old computer parts, cables, and monitors were scattered everywhere, the whole place looking more like a junkyard than a home. Chris told me what's going on, Mike said, sitting down at a desk covered in wires and half disassembled gadgets. But I need more details if I'm going to help you. You said this guy, Andrew, might be the Watcher? I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat as I recounted everything that had happened. The notes, the videos, the dark web. As I spoke, Mike's expression grew more serious, his fingers tapping away at a keyboard as he pulled up various screens on his monitors. When I finished, Mike leaned back in his chair, staring at one of the screens with a frown. The Watcher is more than just a nickname, he said, his voice low. It's an identity, one that's been passed around by different people on the dark web for years. Each person who takes it on has their own methods, but the goal is always the same: control, manipulation, and eventually, disappearance. I felt a chill run down my spine. So Andrew, he's not the first? No, Mike said, shaking his head. But he might be the most dangerous. From what I found, he's been building up to something big, targeting specific people, predicting their futures with frightening accuracy. But how? I asked, my voice trembling. How does he know these things? Mike didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up a file on one of his monitors, showing a series of diagrams and charts that made my head spin just looking at them. I think he's using some kind of predictive algorithm, Mike said, his eyes scanning the data. It's advanced, far beyond anything I've seen before. He's been collecting data on you, on everyone he targets, analyzing your behavior, your choices, even your thoughts. And somehow, he's using that data to manipulate events in your life, steering you toward the outcomes he wants. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It was like something out of a science fiction movie, but it was real, terrifyingly real. Is there any way to stop him? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Mike hesitated, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. Maybe, but it won't be easy. If we can find the source of the algorithm, we might be able to shut it down. But that would require accessing Andrew's network, getting inside his system without him knowing. And if we can't? Chris asked, his voice tense. Mike looked at us, his expression grim. Then you need to disappear completely. No trace, no contact with anyone who knows you. Because as long as Andrew has access to your data, he'll always be one step ahead. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I knew what he was saying was true, but the thought of disappearing, of leaving everything and everyone I knew behind, was almost too much to bear. But what choice did I have? If I stayed, if I tried to fight this, I'd only be playing into Andrew's hands. He had planned everything so meticulously, down to the last detail. The date of my disappearance was already set, just 2 days away. I'm going to try, Mike said suddenly, his hands moving across the keyboard again. I'm going to hack into his network, see if I can find anything that will give us an edge. But you two need to be ready to run at a moment's notice. Chris and I nodded, our hearts pounding in unison. We watched as Mike worked, his eyes narrowing in concentration. The room was filled with the soft clicking of keys, the hum of the computer, and the sound of our own anxious breathing. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. I was on the edge of my seat, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What if Mike couldn't find anything? What if Andrew was already onto us? Suddenly, Mike cursed under his breath, his fingers flying across the keyboard faster than I thought possible. What is it? Chris asked, his voice tight. I'm in, Mike said, his eyes wide. But it's worse than I thought. He's not just targeting you. He's got a whole network of people he's watching, controlling, and it's all connected, like some kind of twisted game. He turned the monitor toward us, showing a map covered in red dots, each one representing a person, a life that Andrew, or the Watcher, was manipulating. My stomach churned as I saw my name among the dots, connected by lines to others I didn't even know. "This isn't just about you," Mike said, his voice trembling slightly. "He's building something, orchestrating events on a massive scale. I don't know what the end game is, but it's coming soon. And if we don't stop it..." His voice trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mike looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I'm going to try and shut it down, but you need to go now. Get out of the city, change your identity, do whatever it takes to stay off the grid. If I can take down the network, you might have a chance. But if I can't..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew what he meant. If he couldn't stop it, I'd be hunted down no matter where I went. Chris grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We need to go, now." I nodded, my legs feeling like jelly as we raced out of Mike's apartment and back to the car. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. But as we drove away, one thing became clear. I wasn't just running from Andrew anymore. I was running from something much bigger, something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. As we sped through the dark, empty streets, I looked back at the city, the place I had called home, knowing I would never see it again. My life, everything I had known, was over. I was about to disappear, just like the others, but I wasn't going to go down without a fight. As we left the city behind, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me. I didn't know if Mike would succeed, or if we would ever truly be safe. But as long as I was alive, there was hope, and that was enough to keep me going. The road stretched out before us, dark and unknown, leading us into a future I couldn't predict. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next, it would be a fight for survival. And I was ready. That's it. That's all I know for now. We're somewhere far from the city, lying low, waiting for word from Mike. But deep down, I know it's not over. Not by a long shot. My brother is a deep web hacker. His next quest cost our family lives. I never really thought much about the deep web until my brother Luke started spending more and more time locked away in his room, typing furiously on his keyboard. Growing up, we were pretty close. Typical sibling stuff, you know. We shared secrets, got into trouble together, and all that. But a couple of years ago, things started to change. He got this obsession with coding and hacking. It was just a hobby at first, but soon it became something more, something darker. It all started with a simple curiosity, or so he said. Luke would stay up late at night, diving into the depths of the internet, places that most people wouldn't even know existed. I didn't really get it at the time, and honestly, I still don't. But I trusted him. He was my older brother, after all, and he seemed to know what he was doing. Plus, he was always so confident, always reassuring me that everything was fine. "It's just a bit of harmless fun," he'd say, flashing me that grin of his, the one that made it hard to argue. But things started getting weird about 6 months ago. I'd hear him at night, talking to people on these encrypted chat rooms, His voice was different, more serious, more intense. He'd be laughing one minute, then dead silent the next, like someone flipped a switch. He was getting deeper and deeper into something, and I could feel it in my gut that it wasn't good. One night, I finally asked him about it. I mean, I had to, right? It was around 2 a.m. and I couldn't sleep. I could hear the faint clicking of his keyboard through the wall. So I got up, walked over to his room, and knocked. There was a pause, a long one, before he finally opened the door a crack. "Luke, what the hell are you doing in there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me for a moment with this strange look in his eyes, like he was weighing something in his mind. Finally, he sighed and let me in. "I'm working on something big," he said, his voice low. "Something that could change everything." That should have been my first clue to back off, but I was too curious for my own good. "What do you mean? Like hacking some big company or something?" He shook his head. "No, not exactly. I found this group. They're into some serious stuff. Deep web level serious. They've got connections, resources, things I didn't even know existed. And they've given me a challenge." The way he said that word, challenge, sent a shiver down my spine. It was like he was talking about a game, but I could tell it was anything but. "What kind of challenge?" He hesitated again, his eyes darting to his computer screen, where lines of code were scrolling by faster than I could read. "I can't tell you much. It's better if you don't know. But it's going to take me places, both online and in real life. Dangerous places." My heart started pounding. I knew Luke was smart, way smarter than me, but this didn't sound like the kind of thing you could just walk away from. "Luke, maybe you should stop. This sounds, I don't know, wrong?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be fine, trust me. Just don't worry about it, okay? I've got this." I wanted to argue, to pull him away from that computer and make him forget whatever he was getting into. But he was so sure, so damn confident, that I ended up just nodding and leaving him to it. That was my mistake. Over the next few weeks, Luke became more distant. He stopped coming to family dinners, barely even left his room except to grab something to eat. When I'd knock on his door, he'd either ignore me or tell me he was busy. And the more I tried to pry, the more he shut me out. Then one day, he disappeared. I came home from school, and his room was empty. Not just his computer or clothes, but everything. It was like he'd never been there. No note, no explanation, nothing. My parents were frantic, called the police, reported him missing, but there were no leads. No one had seen him leave, and there were no signs of struggle. It was like he just vanished into thin air, but I knew better. I knew he was still out there, somewhere, buried deep in the underbelly of the internet, chasing whatever twisted challenge he'd been given. And I knew that if I wanted to find him, I'd have to follow him down that same dark path. That's when the messages started. It was a week after Luke vanished. I was sitting in his room, staring at his empty desk, trying to figure out what to do next when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting it to be another update from the police, but it wasn't. It was a text from an unknown number. No name, no contact info, just a single message. "Are you ready to play?" I stared at it for a long time, my heart racing. I didn't know what it meant, but I had a feeling it was connected to Luke. My hands were shaking as I typed out a reply. "Who is this?" There was no response for a few minutes, and I started to think, Maybe it was just some sick prank, but then my phone buzzed again. Follow the rabbit hole. Attached was a link, nothing fancy, just a string of letters and numbers that didn't make any sense to me. I knew I should have ignored it, should have deleted the message and told my parents, or the cops, but I couldn't. I had to know. So, I clicked the link. I wish I hadn't. The link took me to a page I'd never seen before. It wasn't like your usual website. There was no flashy interface or anything, just a black background with a single blinking cursor in the center of the screen. It felt like something out of an old hacker movie, but this was real. Too real. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears that I almost didn't notice the faint sound of something, a soft static or whisper coming from my speakers. I stared at the screen, unsure of what to do, but before I could even think of typing anything, the cursor started moving on its own. "Hello, Luke's brother. We've been expecting you." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How did they know who I was? How did they know Luke? Every instinct screamed at me to close the page, to walk away, but I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to find Luke. The text continued. "Your brother made a choice. Now it's your turn. Are you willing to go as far as he did?" I didn't know what they were asking, but I typed back, my fingers trembling. "Where is he? What did you do to him?" There was a pause, and for a moment I thought maybe they wouldn't answer, but then more text appeared. "He's with us now. If you want to see him again, you'll need to prove yourself. Complete the tasks, and you'll find him. Fail, and he's lost forever." A cold dread settled in my stomach. This wasn't just some online game or challenge. It was something far more sinister, something that had already taken my brother. But what choice did I have? If there was any chance of finding Luke, I had to do whatever they wanted. "What do I need to do?" I typed, swallowing my fear. This time, the response came quickly. "Your first task is simple. Retrieve the package from the location we send you. Do not open it. Do not ask questions. Deliver it to the address provided." Before I could reply, a new message popped up with an address. It was a location in a part of town I didn't recognize, somewhere on the outskirts, where the city started to bleed into the countryside. I'd never been there before, but the thought of going alone, especially at night, sent chills down my spine. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, but then another message appeared. "Time is running out. Do not fail him." That did it. Whatever this was, they had Luke, and if there was any chance of getting him back, I had to go. I grabbed my coat and headed out, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, each one worse than the last. The drive to the address took nearly an hour. The streets grew quieter, the houses fewer and farther apart, until I was driving down a narrow, unlit road surrounded by trees. The GPS on my phone led me to a small clearing just off the road, a spot so secluded that I wouldn't have noticed it if not for the faint glow of my headlights. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small wooden box, barely the size of a shoebox. It was plain, no markings or labels, just sitting there in the dirt like someone had left it for me to find. I got out of the car, glancing around nervously, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but the night was still, too still, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I approached the box slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. When I reached it, I crouched down and carefully picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, the wood cool and smooth under my fingers. I was about to head back to my car when my phone buzzed again. "Take it to the address. Do not open it." The message was followed by another address, this one in a more familiar part of town, closer to the city center. I didn't reply, just got back into my car and started driving. The box sat on the passenger seat next to me, a silent, ominous presence. The roads were deserted as I drove, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The city was eerily quiet at this hour, as if it was holding its breath along with me. Every now and then, I'd glance at the box, fighting the urge to open it, to see what was inside. But something in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded too much like Luke's, told me not to. Finally, I reached the address. It was an old apartment building, the kind that had seen better days. The windows were dark, and the whole place looked abandoned, like it hadn't been lived in for years. I parked the car and grabbed the box, my heart racing as I approached the door. The instructions hadn't mentioned anything about knocking, so I just stood there, feeling foolish, with the box in my hands. But before I could decide what to do, the door creaked open. There was no one there, just a yawning darkness that seemed to swallow the dim light from the street lamp outside. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But then a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a long coat that brushed the floor. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. "You have the package," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel crunching underfoot. I nodded, too scared to speak, and held out the box. The man took it from me, without a word, his long fingers brushing against mine, cold as ice. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the darkness behind him, a flicker of movement, but when I blinked, it was gone. "Tell your brother," the man said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "that this is only the beginning." Then he turned and disappeared into the building, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before I finally turned and walked back to my car. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with questions and fears I didn't want to face. When I got home, I found another message waiting for me. "Well done. The next task will come soon. Be ready." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, or what little I'd seen of it, and the darkness that seemed to swallow everything around him. And always, I heard his voice, echoing in my mind. This is only the beginning. The days after the delivery dragged on in a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. I was a wreck, constantly jumping at shadows, expecting the next task to come at any moment. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat, my stomach twisting into knots. But nothing came, not for a while anyway. During that time, I tried to act normal around my parents, but I could tell they were still on edge about Luke's disappearance. My mom cried almost every night, thinking we couldn't hear her, and my dad threw himself into work, avoiding the subject altogether. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, one where every day was just a countdown to something worse. Then one evening, just as the sun was setting and casting long, eerie shadows across my room, my phone buzzed again. I nearly dropped it in my rush to check the screen, dreading and hoping at the same time that it was another message from them. It was. Time for the next task. Find the place where the lost meet the forgotten. There was no address this time, no clear instructions, just that cryptic sentence. I stared at it, trying to make sense of the words. It sounded like some kind of riddle, but I had no idea where to even start. I spent hours online, searching every phrase I could think of, but nothing made sense. The deeper I dug, the more frustrated and panicked I became. It wasn't until I nearly gave up that I remembered something Luke had said to me months ago, back when he first started getting into this deep web stuff. He'd mentioned a place online, a forum of sorts, where people would go when they had nowhere else to turn. It was a dark corner of the deep web, a place where the lost could connect with the forgotten. At the time, I didn't really pay attention, but now, those words felt like a clue. My hands shook as I powered up my laptop, knowing full well I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. I had seen enough stories and warnings to know the deep web wasn't a place to mess around, but I had no choice, not if I wanted to find Luke. Using a Tor browser, I navigated the shadowy, anonymous paths that led to the site Luke had mentioned. The homepage was simple, just a black background with a single line of text. Where the lost meet the forgotten. My heart raced as I clicked on it, and the screen faded to reveal a forum with thread titles that sent chills down my spine. Lost known locations, final conversations, where they vanished. Each thread was a pit of despair, filled with posts from people searching for loved ones who had disappeared without a trace. There were theories, desperate pleas, and disturbing patterns that began to emerge as I scrolled through the pages. But nothing stood out until I found a thread titled The Whispering Web. It had far fewer replies than the others, but the ones it did have were different, more cryptic, almost like they were speaking in code. They hear you when you sleep, one post read. The web is alive, and it knows your secrets. Another said, the forgotten are always listening. They whisper through the wires, waiting for you to join them. I didn't know what it meant, but something about the thread felt right, like it was leading me toward the answer I was looking for. I clicked on the last post, which was only a few days old. It simply read, to find the lost, you must listen to the forgotten. They wait in the silence, just beneath the surface. Follow their whispers, and they'll lead you to him. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the post had been made on the very day Luke disappeared. Whoever these people were, they knew what had happened to him, and they were leading me into something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. I followed the link at the bottom of the post, which led to another page deep within the site. The background was the same inky black, but this time there was no text, just a low, continuous hum coming from my speakers. It was almost too faint to hear, but as I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't just a hum. It was a series of whispers, overlapping and intertwining like voices in a crowded room. My skin crawled as I strained to make out the words. They were just on the edge of comprehension, like they were slipping away the moment I thought I understood them. But one phrase kept repeating, clearer than the others. Come to us. The whispers grew louder, filling my room with an eerie, oppressive weight. I tried to close the browser, but my laptop froze. The screen locked on that black void, the whispers growing more insistent. Panic surged through me as I slammed my hand against the power button, but the computer wouldn't shut off. It was like the whispers had taken control, their voices seeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts. Come to us, come to us, come to us. I felt a pressure building in my head, like something was pushing against my skull, trying to get in. I stumbled back from the desk, my vision swimming, and I thought I saw something move in the shadows behind me, just out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and thin, like the man I'd seen at the apartment, watching me from the darkness, but when I turned, there was nothing there. just the whispers echoing in my ears. Finally, with one last desperate shove, I managed to force the laptop to shut down. The screen went black, and the whispers cut off, leaving me in a silence so thick it felt suffocating. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. I didn't know what was happening, but I was certain of one thing. I was getting closer to something that was pulling me deeper into a world I didn't understand. And wherever it was leading me, Luke was already there, waiting. The following days were a blur. I barely left my room, consumed by the growing sense of dread that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. The whispers from the website haunted me, echoing in my head, even when I wasn't at the computer. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows shifting in the corners of my room, and when I did manage to drift off, I was jolted awake by nightmares I couldn't quite remember. I knew I was losing it, but I couldn't stop. Whatever had taken Luke was pulling me deeper, and I couldn't turn back now. I spent hours trying to make sense of the whispers, replaying them in my mind, searching for any clue, any hidden meaning. But the more I thought about them, the more they seemed to slip away, like trying to grasp smoke. Then late one night, when I was on the edge of giving up, my phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with a new message, this time without any pretense of riddles or cryptic clues. The forgotten are waiting. You know where to find them. There was no address, no instructions, just that one ominous sentence. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out what it meant. And then, suddenly, it clicked. The forgotten weren't just a concept. They were real, something physical, and I knew exactly where they were. When we were kids, Luke and I used to explore this old abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that everyone knew about, but never talked about. A relic from a time long past, decaying and forgotten. It was mostly just a crumbling warehouse with broken windows and rusted metal. But to us, it was a playground. A place to escape when the world felt too small. We called it the Forgotten Place, a name that seemed fitting for something so lost to time. As we grew older, we stopped going there, but now the name came rushing back to me, along with a cold realization that was where they wanted me to go. It was a little after midnight when I grabbed my keys and headed out. The streets were empty, the world around me silent and still. The drive to the Forgotten Place took less than half an hour, but it felt like an eternity. As I pulled up to the old warehouse, my headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar, dilapidated structure. The place looked even worse than I remembered. The roof had partially collapsed, and vines had started reclaiming the walls, twisting through the broken windows like fingers of some ancient, hungry creature. A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped out of the car, the night air cold and biting against my skin. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the building, trying to muster the courage to go inside. The whispers were back, faint but persistent, urging me forward. I swallowed my fear and started walking, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loud in the stillness. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking ominously as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of decay overwhelming. My flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. I half expected something to jump out at me, but the place was as empty as ever. At least that's what I tried to tell myself. I made my way deeper into the building, my heart pounding in my chest. The interior was a maze of debris and forgotten machinery, the remnants of whatever industry had once thrived here. As I moved through the shadows, memories of exploring this place with Luke flooded back, but they felt distant, almost like they belonged to someone else. Then I found it. In the far corner of the building, hidden behind a pile of rusted metal and rotting wood, was a door I didn't remember ever seeing before. It was old, much older than the rest of the building, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The symbols were worn, almost invisible, but they gave off an unsettling feeling, like they were watching me, judging me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent as I approached the door. My hand shook as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough wood. A part of me screamed to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But I knew I couldn't. Luke was somewhere on the other side of that door, and I was the only one who could find him. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything I'd expected. It was small, cramped, with walls that seemed to close in the moment I stepped inside. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was Luke. He was standing with his back to me, his head slightly bowed, his hands at his sides. Relief and fear flooded through me at once. I called out to him, but he didn't respond, didn't even move. My voice trembled as I called his name again, but still, nothing. I took a cautious step forward, then another. The room felt wrong, the air thick and oppressive, as if the very walls were pressing in on us. I reached out, my hand inches from his shoulder, when he finally spoke. "You shouldn't have come." His voice was flat, emotionless, so unlike the Luke I knew. A chill ran through me as he slowly turned to face me. But when I saw his eyes, I knew something was terribly wrong. They weren't Luke's eyes. They were dark, hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him. His face was pale, almost translucent, and there was something off about his expression, something twisted. "Luke, what happened to you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was cold, empty, like the smile of someone who'd forgotten how to feel. "I'm not Luke anymore. Not really. I'm one of them now." Before I could react, the door behind me slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the small room. I spun around, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I turned back to Luke, who was now standing impossibly close, his empty eyes locked on mine. "You've come this far," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "You followed the whispers, but now you're trapped, just like I was." The room seemed to darken, the walls closing in until I could barely breathe. The whispers were everywhere now, growing louder and more frantic, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. "This place, it's where the forgotten dwell," Luke continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "We're all lost here, trapped between worlds, between life and death. And now, so are you." I backed away, my heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. The room was suffocating, the air thick with something unseen, something that felt alive, watching us, waiting. "You need to leave," Luke said, his voice suddenly urgent. "Get out while you still can. But remember this, once you leave, you'll never be the same. You'll always be marked, always be hunted. They'll find you, no matter where you go." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned back to the door, slamming my shoulder against it with all my strength. It groaned under the pressure, but finally it gave way, and I stumbled out into the main room of the warehouse, gasping for air. The whispers were still there, lingering at the edges of my consciousness, but they were fading, becoming distant echoes. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran for the exit, my feet pounding against the concrete floor, every instinct screaming at me to get out, to escape this nightmare. When I finally burst through the front door and into the cold night air, I didn't stop running. I didn't even glance back at the warehouse. I just kept going, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But even as I ran, I knew it wasn't over. The whispers, the forgotten, Luke, they weren't done with me. They'd mark me, just as Luke had warned. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, they would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to pull me back into the darkness. The days following my escape from the forgotten place were a blur of fear and paranoia. I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares were relentless, filled with shadowy figures and the hollow eyes of my brother. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I knew I couldn't stay at home. My parents, already devastated by Luke's disappearance, were growing more concerned about me. I could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at me like I was slipping away, just like Luke had. I couldn't put them through any more pain, so I did the only thing I could think of. I packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. I didn't have a plan. I just drove, heading out of town and into the countryside, where the roads were empty and the night was pitch black. I thought that maybe if I got far enough away, I could escape whatever was haunting me. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I stopped at a small motel hours later, too exhausted to keep driving. The room was dingy, the bed lumpy, but I didn't care. I just needed to rest, to gather my thoughts, and figure out what to do next. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I was back in that room, standing before Luke, his empty eyes staring into mine. "You can't run," his voice echoed in my mind. "They'll always find you." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet room. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what message was waiting for me, but I knew I had no choice. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone. The screen lit up with a new message. "It's time. The final task awaits. Come to where it all began." I stared at the words, a cold dread settling. In my stomach, there was only one place that could mean home. I wanted to ignore it, to throw my phone away and keep driving until I ran out of road, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They would find me, no matter where I went, and if I didn't finish what I started, they would take me, just like they took Luke. The drive back home was the longest I'd ever taken. The roads seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The closer I got to home, the heavier the air became, thick with a sense of impending doom. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was barely holding it together. The house was dark, my parents likely asleep, unaware of the horrors that had taken root in their lives. I hesitated at the front door, my hand hovering over the handle, afraid of what I might find inside. But the whispers pushed me forward, urging me to finish what had begun. The house was eerily quiet as I stepped inside, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I moved through the darkened hallway, every step feeling like it was taking me closer to something terrible. The whispers were louder now, echoing off the walls, guiding me to the source. They led me to Luke's room. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but I knew there was no turning back. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he had left it, but the air was thick with a presence I couldn't see. The whispers swirled around me, growing louder, more insistent. And then, as if in response, the computer on Luke's desk flickered to life. The screen glowed in the darkness, the same black background and blinking cursor that had started this nightmare. My hands shook as I approached the desk, dread pooling in my stomach. The cursor blinked a few times, and then a message appeared on the screen. "Welcome back. Are you ready to finish this?" I didn't know what to say, what to do. My mind was racing, 100 thoughts crashing into each other, but nothing made sense. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't matter. This thing, whatever it was, didn't care about me. It only wanted one thing: completion. With a shaky breath, I typed a single word: yes. For a moment, nothing happened. The screen remained still, the cursor blinking, as if waiting for something. Then the screen filled with a text, lines of code flashing by faster than I could read. The room seemed to darken around me, the air growing colder, heavier. The whispers reached a fever pitch, swirling around me in a chaotic storm of voices, each one trying to be heard over the others. And then, in the midst of the noise, I heard Luke's voice, clear and desperate. "It's a trap. Get out." The screen went black. The room plunged into darkness, the whispers abruptly silenced. I stumbled back, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I was alone, but I could feel something in the room with me, something cold and malevolent. The air pressed in on me, making it hard to breathe, and the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, began to materialize in the room. They emerged from the walls, from the corners, moving silently toward me. Their forms were twisted, wrong, as if they were barely clinging to the shape of human beings. And at their center, leading them, was Luke. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark, but there was a sadness in his expression that cut through the terror gripping me. He reached out a hand as if to touch me, to comfort me, but something held him back. "They're here for you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They want to take you, like they took me, but you can still escape." I shook my head, unable to speak, the fear choking me. The figures were closing in, their dark forms pressing against me, suffocating me with their presence. "Listen to me," Luke said, his voice urgent. "You have to finish it. Complete the final task. It's the only way." I didn't understand, didn't know what he meant, but before I could ask, the figures surged forward, their cold hands grasping at me, pulling me down into the darkness. I struggled, fought against them, but it was like trying to fight shadows. Their grip was cold, numbing, draining the life out of me. I felt myself slipping away, the room fading around me, the darkness consuming everything. But then, through the haze of fear and pain, I remembered the computer. The final task. I had to finish it. With the last of my strength, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the keyboard. I didn't know what to type, didn't know what to do, but I let my instincts guide me. The words came to me, unbidden, and I typed them out, each keystroke a struggle against the darkness pulling me under. I release you. The moment the words appeared on the screen, the figures froze. The darkness around me seemed to recoil, pulling back, loosening its grip. The whispers, once deafening, faded into a distant murmur, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The figures dissolved, melting back into the shadows. The air in the room lightened, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. I gasped for breath, my heart racing, my body trembling from the ordeal. Luke was gone. The room was empty. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. The computer screen was blank, the text gone, as if nothing had ever been there. The whispers were silent, the house eerily quiet, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Not really. Luke's warning echoed in my mind, a reminder that I'd been marked, that they would always be there, waiting in the shadows. I left the house that night, without saying goodbye. I couldn't stay, couldn't risk putting my parents in danger. I drove until the sun came up, the road stretching out before me, leading me away from the horrors I'd left behind. But no matter how far I go, I can still hear them, those whispers, just at the edge of my consciousness, always waiting, always watching, and I know one day they'll come for me again.